Hey guys, it's Em. And I'm just gonna say it. I really like Dark Souls 2. I know this is a controversial take in the Souls community. Honestly, what isn't? But DS2 is probably one of my favorite games. Period. It's a comfort game I fall back on anytime I want to play something but can't think of anything else. I've attempted to make this script far more times than I'd care to admit, but I really want to talk about this game. It's not perfect, but I love it so much, I feel like I just have to. Just to clarify, this video isn't going to be me blindly defending DS2 or engaging with many arguments people put against it, because most of it's subjective. Because some parts I like about it, people just hate, and no matter how many words I can put in this script, I'm most likely not going to change their minds. I'm just going to talk about why I like the game, despite how different it is from the others in the series. The areas in DS2 are visually amazing. I've played a lot of games, and I can't think of any others where I stopped and looked at the scenery as many times as I have in this one. And the weirdest part is, I'm not even a graphics guy. It's more of an add-on thing to the experience, kind of like how music is. Something that you notice if it's bad, but if it's average, it's more of a passing thing. But the visual direction was so good here, I couldn't help but stop and look over the world multiple times. Then there's the levels themselves, which every time I play this game, I feel like I find some weird new way to interact with the world. Brightstone Cell Door is an area infested with spiders. You're first introduced to them in a dark cave, which most people's natural reaction would be to light a torch, or maybe light the thing in the middle of the room. If you do this, you'll find out that the spiders are afraid of torches and won't attack you if you're holding one. Leading to this trait where if you don't want to fight the spiders in this area, you don't have to, but you'd have to hold a torch, which means you can't two-hand or dual-wield your weapons. This effect even carries over to the boss fight, meaning if you hold the torch, you won't have to deal with any of the surrounding spiders, but your damage against the boss will be drastically reduced. Something similar goes for No Man's Wharf. They have these dark creatures near the top of the map that hide from all the lights below. If you have a torch, they'll cower in fear and back away from you. Then there's other mechanics I could get into, like explosive barrels or poison barrels. In the Forest of Giants, you'll come across these areas that are littered with explosive barrels and people throwing firebombs down at you in an attempt to blow you up. Now, if you're an average player, you just try to run past them without exploding. But if you think for a moment, you can shoot the barrels yourself or throw something at them to make them blow up on the enemies. There's a lot of big brain smart moments you can have that reward you for not just being good at the combat, but actually paying attention to your surroundings. And what I've mentioned is just the tip of the iceberg. I could mention the NPC phantoms that'll guide you to side areas and emote when you succeed, blowing up walls to reveal secret areas, lighting the oil monsters' puddles on fire, but if I go into all these small amazing things that this game does just off of the areas, we would be here all day. All these aspects together give you the feeling that you're really on a journey across this fantasy world. DS3 and 1 have those feelings too, but due to those games compromising bigger levels for less of them, alongside the fact that they don't have the same level of interactivity this game's did, it's not really a fair comparison in that regard. And all this alongside the fact that this game is huge. There's so many areas to explore. It's pretty much the closest we got to an open world Dark Souls without going straight open world like Elden Ring did, which I'm personally more of a fan of. Then alongside all of that, this is the only Souls game that runs at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second, which sounds very nerdy but is really noticeable in comparison to 1 and 3's 30 frames. And right before I get off of this point, somewhat still related to the world of the NPCs. DS1 and 3's points where the world is dying due to the fading of the first flame. Multiple NPCs end up dead by the end of both games. It's meant to hammer in that something needs to change. In 1, it's mostly focusing on continuing the cycle, while 3 focuses on needing a new one, as the Age of Fire has been extended for far too long. 2 doesn't really revolve around the flame. It revolves around solving the undead curse. We do lose a few NPCs along the way, but this in itself isn't a world-ending event, so there's a lot more NPCs alive at the end of this game. It gives you a glimmer of hope, that even though everything else sucks, you've helped guide all these people here that are just trying to solve their own problems, or just make it around Drang-like. No matter how hopeless the rest of the world has gotten, you have this little area of people, and it makes you feel like you've made a tangible difference here. A point I've heard brought up against them is there's a lot of them, and they aren't really super deep or interesting. This didn't bother me so much because of, again, how many of them there are. Along with the fact, unlike in 3 and 1, many of them weren't on super important journeys for bigger purpose. They were just everyday people trying to get by in this land. So them not going on life or death adventures which causes them to die made sense to me. They found a safe place so they stay there. That's all it is. Then we do still have our tragic NPCs like Lucatiel, which is one of my favorite characters in the series, or Vengarl, who is, again, probably one of my favorites due to how cool he is. He's the only time I can think of recently where I sat through mountains of dialogue just to hear how interesting his past was. Due to DS2 being the longest Dark Souls game, it has an abundance of cool items and clothing, to where there's so many things for you to use and choose from, it would take you forever to go through them all. Fashion Souls is very subjective, so I don't want to focus on this point for too long, but I feel this game has the best drip out of any of the other Souls games. Most of the sets just work. You can mix and match many of the outfits and they'll still look great. You'd have to intentionally go out of your way to make a character that looks mismatched and ugly in this game. As for the weapons, there are so many unique weapons that never left this game, it's a crime. Things like beam swords, hurricane great swords, Street Fighter fist weapons, the fucking dual-wield Artorias flip. It's actually crazy how much variety there is here. Many weapons even have unique animations or unique power stance attacks, which I didn't even learn was a thing until way later. Since this was before DS3 nerfed pretty much everything, almost all the weapons you can get in this game are viable. So many of them I found weird, unique applications for. And it feels great going through all of them to see what they can do. Many of the crazier ones drop closer to the end of the game, so they help carry this tangible sense of progression as you go on. And as a rarity, there isn't really one class you can feel that's missing out on content. Mages, archers, and your standard melee dudes can choose to main any weapon and they'll still feel like there are multiple options open for you. To the point where there's a lot of subclass types you could try too. And since this game will leave you a way higher level than the other two Souls games due to its length, you may be able to even dip into two classes at the same time. This game feels like it dove way deeper into the RPG side of things than the other two did, and it's greatly appreciated. Bosses in DS2 are a very divisive topic. Most of them are okay at best. Many regard DS2 bosses as horrible rejects in comparison to the rest of the games, but I don't see it this way at all. Many of them are mid, yeah, but to be frank, DS3 was the only game where a majority of the bosses were more than mid. DS1 only had 3 okay bosses that didn't turn like buses. Those being Gwyn, who can be parried to death, and Artorias and Manus, who are at the tippy end of the game in the DLC. DS2 has Fume Knight, Elan, and Burnt Ivory King. I don't see why it's such a pressing point to say that DS2's bosses are mid, when other than designs, DS1 suffered from the exact same problem. For me, the bosses in DS2 fill out the journey. They aren't pressing roadblocks of difficulty, but they help cement that feeling even further than everything else I mentioned. Fighting dragons, frog demons, knights, and whatever the rotten is just feels cool. It feels cool to fight all these fantasy bosses. Sure, I'd love it if they were on Gale's level, good move-wise, but them not being peak just wasn't really a concern for me. And since there's so many of them in this game, it leads to a lot of items, spells, and things I gushed over in the last section. It helps that some of the bosses have multiple items you can get from one soul, which gives you a good incentive to fight some of them 3 or so times. New game is a point I wouldn't really bring up in any of the other Souls games, mainly because you're replaying the same thing again. But DS2 changes as you go into New Game. Not just once, but I believe up to 3 or 4 times the enemies in the area will change. This leads to there actually being new experiences in your repeated playthrough. If you thought the base areas were too easy, some here get filled with red phantoms or new enemy types as a whole, such as the Greater Undead. But then they will also get new moves, like the Falconer getting Falcon. I can guarantee you 99% of players got to New Game and shat themselves seeing 3 strong enemies in the tutorial area. It keeps you interested on seeing how everything else changes. And I'm really upset this didn't transfer to any of the other games in this series, but oh well. DS2 had so many quality of life changes that no one seems to want to talk about. It's actually crazy. First of all, 360-degree rolling. I'll admit DS1 is the game I have the least amount of replays on, but every time I come back and I can only roll in 4 directions, my brain almost conks out. It's not the most pressing issue in the world, but it feels weird when you're holding a direction and your character just doesn't go that way. While minor, it helps smooth combat. Second, you can actually jump in this game. We weren't at the point of Elden Ring or Sekiro, where it's just a normal jump, but when you hit the button, your character actually springs forward. This is in contrast to the other game where your character kind of clumps slightly upwards and stops. Third, your character feels alive. I don't know how to word it exactly, but your character reacts to the state they're in. If their health is low, they'll hunch over. If they run out of stamina, they'll start panting. I have legitimately no idea how this wasn't ported into literally any other video game that they made, but it adds to the whole you are going on this journey deal. It's cool to see when you beat up a hard boss and your character seems to still be recovering from the engagement. Fourth, you don't have to beat the whole game to go in the New Game. Bonfire Stacks will help you if you wanted to get a specific boss's second soul weapon or drop, or just a drop from enemies that don't respawn. Respecking. I don't know why Dark Souls tends to forget it's an RPG, but respecking just wasn't in the first game, which I think is the main reason I haven't replayed it much. There isn't really that much to add to this point because it's just something they slowly ironed out over time, with it even getting better in 3. You couldn't even re-customize your character until the 3rd game. And there's probably a few little other things I could go into at this point, but I'll stop here for that. Balanced power stancing. This is a point I wanted to bring up since Elden Ring decided to bring back power stancing. And note, I'm not saying all this to bash Elden Ring, as I like that game too, but since it's the only other game they made with this feature, I have to use it as a comparison. I feel power stancing was handled better here than it was in Elden Ring. As I mentioned earlier, some of the weapons give you access to unique power attacks, special moves, or etc., depending on what your weapon is on your other hand, which Elden Ring didn't do at all. I'm not saying it like it's some super deep thing, but it shows a nice level of care and detail. And despite people saying this point is a cop-out, having certain moves depending on your power stance can affect the way you play the game. I guarantee you anyone who's used the Bone Fist will entirely understand what I mean by this. Then there's the small detail where you can power stance smaller weapons with your bigger weapon. If you have a greatsword in one hand and a normal sword on the other hand, you can still power stance it. I'm sure it's good for certain builds, but I just think it looks cool as fuck. It's a nice little inclusion I appreciate. Then we have to talk about the more serious effect on gameplay power stancing has in these two games. In ER, there's literally no reason to not power stance. It's just better than any other option you have, unless your character weight becomes too much, which is mainly only a problem for greatswords and other huge weapons. In DS2, power stancing was a trade. You can shard out damage, but it absolutely destroys your stamina. I remember my first playthrough I used the Bandit Axe, and since I beat Elden Ring before this game, I assumed that when I'd get another one and leveled it up, I'd pretty much be able to destroy everything easily. But you can only swing the things 3 or so times before your character runs out of stamina. So I quickly learned to only power stance in certain situations, because otherwise, it's not just the best course of action. This effect also bleeds into PvP. As anyone who's played Elden Ring will most likely know, it's very easy to dual wield certain weapons and just mash out things with little consequence. In DS2, this just isn't much of a problem. The only time it is if someone's trying to trick one-shot you, but if they miss, they usually die immediately. I know I said I wouldn't go hard into what people say against this game, but at some points, I feel if I make this video and don't address them, I'm probably going to regret since I don't know what other excuse I'd have to talk about DS2 after this. Overlapping on the map. While I like the map, some people point out how it's nonsensical. Like how Earthen Peaks goes up into lava, or the Drang Lake Castle goes down into the Shrine of Amano where you can literally see the sky. I get why it rumples people, as the other Souls games don't really have this problem, and some people see it as immersion breaking, but I don't see this as a game ruining thing. There's another problem I feel with it too, but I don't know if it's a common complaint. The areas just aren't big enough. DS2 has amazing set pieces at times, only for you to stay in the area for 20 or 30 minutes. I would have loved to stay in some of these areas longer, but I guess it wasn't in the cards. Hitboxes. A lot of people complain about the hitboxes in this game, and I can see why. It's very easy to get hit by the back of some attacks in this game, or the hitbox just feels like it stays way longer than it should have. I understand the complaint. I don't think it happens enough to the point where it's game ruining, but I could see it getting some cheap deaths off on you. But I think it came with the territory, honestly. Since DS1 has some weird hitboxes to it, and since this game is pretty much double or more its size, it was bound to have a few goofy hitboxes slip through the cracks. There isn't really a definitive comeback I have to this one other than I don't see it as super bad. ADP is the stat introduced and ended in DS2. It's the stat that affects rolling speed and item usage speeds. Most people say it's an unnecessary stat, which I'll just say they have a point. It is an entirely unnecessary stat. I'm not sure why they felt the need to add it, alongside the fact they didn't feel the need to point out how important this stat in the game is. That being said, a lot of people lean on this stat as the pressing issue that destroys this game, when I just don't find it that way. Once you get around 25 levels in ADP, your character will function like a normal Souls character. Above that, and you'll have one of the most busted dodges in this series, alongside super fast item usage. But if you go below that, you'll have the worst dodge in the game and very slow item usage. If you were stuck with low ADP for a majority of the game, I'd see it as a problem. But since this is the Souls game where it's the easiest to level up, you can hit 25 or more ADP once you get past the first area if you really wanted to and never have to worry about it again. Once you understand how it works, I don't find it to be the horrible system that absolutely ruins this game. Hell, some people, including me, just thought they made roll timings tighter and healing was slowed in general, and beat the game with base ADP anyway. Enemy ganks. One of the issues people have with DS2, but mainly Scholar of the First Sin Edition, is that there are enemies everywhere. 1 and 3 don't have anywhere near the amount of enemies that this game has, but I think it's all manageable as long as you're not speedrunning past enemies without a plan. Given most of the enemies in this game aren't exactly healthy or have fast, flashy attacks, beyond my first playthrough, I didn't die to them too much unless I did something stupid. Most of the time, if there's more than 1 or 2 enemies attacking you, they're either really weak or they have a gimmick. Of course, there are exceptions like the old Iron King's area in the DLC or the Shrine of Amana, but for the most part, I feel like the rules I said still stand. But I just find it different, not necessarily a flaw with the game. Just to tack one thing onto this point, there's also way more NPC invasions in this game. which made me actually use the giant seed, which I never really had a reason to use in the other games. It's fun to pop them and see all the chaos that happens from it. Life gems. Life gems are very controversial, and it's not really a one side's wrong and doesn't understand the intentions kind of situation. I think it's just genuinely a matter of opinion. Life gems do make healing way easier than it is in any of the other Souls games. You can hold 99 of them at a time, and as long as you don't get ragdolled in most of your encounters, you can walk off any situation in the game. And given ADP exists, it's not that hard to find opportunities to pop them in boss fights either. It made the game a lot more casual in that sense than the other two. Do I think someone new to a Souls game would get destroyed all the same? Yes. But for vets of this series, it makes sense that they'd complain about this. As I said, it's more of a difference in opinion thing than a fact thing. Combat speed. Combat speed's been slowed down. Your attacks, your stamina recovery, enemy attacks, all that has been noticeably made slower. 1's fights aren't exactly lightning fast, but they were relatively quick. And one of the main complaints people had about DS3 was the fact that the bosses went overboard on speed. 2 is slower than both of the games I previously mentioned, which isn't exactly a bad thing. If there were this many enemies attacking you with the speed DS1 or 3 did, the game would feel like a mod made by some 10-year-old. But since combat is overall slower and it's not just you, it feels like you can take in what's happening. Like the previous point I made, I feel like it's just a difference in opinion here. I still feel like it's Dark Souls. You're still learning attacks and punishing accordingly. You just have to be a bit more deliberate with what you're doing. In conclusion, DS2 is my comfort game. I understand it isn't perfect, but there's so many good and positive changes that the game made. To say it did nothing for the series would just be lying. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things that can and have divided how people think about this game. I don't blame people for saying it's not their favorite, but I feel I see a cartoonish amount of hate for it for no reason other than other people said so. And since it's the internet, I'm sure a good clump of people who say it's bad haven't even tried the game. Does it feel like it pushes certain different values than the previous games? Sure. Is it an absolute garbage stain on the series? No, not really. While it is different, I'm happy they at least tried to make a unique experience, and I feel I'm not alone with that thought process. DS2 will most likely always be the black sheep of the franchise, but I feel for us who enjoy the game, being different and trying new things doesn't make it bad. I hope I may have changed a few minds about this game or made some people want to try it, but at the end of the day, I want to know what you guys think. As always, as long as you guys are respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments, and I've been M, and I am out.